Summary of The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma by Bessel van der Kolk M.D. Let's enjoy the video. Please subscribing to my channel for more great content like this. You'll be notified when I upload new videos. The Body Keeps the Score is a groundbreaking book that explores the effects of trauma on the mind and body. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, a renowned psychiatrist and researcher in the field of post-traumatic stress, draws on his decades of experience to present a comprehensive understanding of trauma and its impact. The book begins by explaining how trauma affects the brain and nervous system. Van der Kolk describes how traumatic experiences can overwhelm the brain's normal functioning, leading to a disconnect between mind and body. This disconnection can result in a variety of symptoms, including flashbacks, nightmares, anxiety, depression, and physical ailments. Van der Kolk then delves into the history of trauma research and treatment, critiquing traditional approaches that often fail to address the full scope of trauma's impact. He argues that the current diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, are inadequate and do not capture the full range of trauma responses. The author emphasizes the importance of understanding trauma from a biological perspective. He explains how trauma can alter the brain's structure and function, particularly in areas responsible for emotion regulation, memory, and stress response. This biological approach helps to explain why many trauma survivors struggle with issues like emotional regulation, attention, and interpersonal relationships. A significant portion of the book is dedicated to exploring various treatment approaches for trauma. Van der Kolk advocates for a holistic approach that addresses both the mind and body. He discusses traditional therapies like talk therapy and medication, but also emphasizes the importance of body-based approaches such as yoga, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, neurofeedback, and theater. The author shares numerous case studies and personal anecdotes throughout the book, bringing the theories and concepts to life through real-world examples. These stories illustrate both the devastating effects of trauma and the potential for healing and recovery. Van der Kolk also addresses the societal implications of trauma, discussing how childhood trauma, in particular, can have long-lasting effects on individuals and communities. He argues for a greater emphasis on trauma-informed care in various sectors, including healthcare, education, and the justice system. The book concludes with a message of hope, emphasizing that recovery from trauma is possible. Van der Kolk stresses the importance of reconnecting with one's body, finding ways to feel safe and in control, and building meaningful connections with others as key components of the healing process. Key concepts. 1. The mind-body connection. Trauma affects both the mind and body, and healing must address both aspects. 2. Neurobiology of trauma. Traumatic experiences can alter brain structure and function, particularly in areas related to emotion regulation and stress response. 3. Developmental trauma. Childhood trauma can have profound and long-lasting effects on an individual's physical and mental health. 4. Body-based therapies. Approaches that involve the body, such as yoga and EMDR, can be highly effective in treating trauma. 5. The importance of safety. Establishing a sense of safety is crucial for trauma recovery. 6. Dysregulation. Trauma can lead to difficulties in regulating emotions, attention, and arousal. 7. Dissociation. Many trauma survivors experience a disconnect between their thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations. 8. Re-establishing control. Helping trauma survivors regain a sense of control over their lives is a key aspect of treatment. 9. Social support. Meaningful connections with others play a vital role in trauma recovery. 10. Neuroplasticity. The brain's ability to change and adapt offers hope for recovery from trauma. 11. Holistic approach. Effective trauma treatment often involves a combination of approaches addressing mind, body, and social connections. 12. Trauma-informed care. There's a need for greater awareness and understanding of trauma across various societal institutions. This book provides a comprehensive overview of trauma, its effects, and potential paths to healing, making it a valuable resource for both professionals and individuals seeking to understand and address the impact of trauma. Chapter 1. Introducing the concept of trauma and its impact on individuals and society. Here's a narrative explanation of this chapter. Dr. van der Kolk begins by taking us back to the 1970s when he was a young psychiatrist working at the Veterans Administration. It was here that he first encountered the profound and long-lasting effects of trauma on the human mind and body. He describes meeting veterans who, years after returning from Vietnam, were still haunted by their experiences. These men struggled with nightmares, flashbacks, and an inability to feel safe in their own bodies. The author recounts how, at the time, there was little understanding of how to treat these veterans effectively. The prevailing approach was to prescribe medications and encourage patients to forget about their traumatic experiences. However, Van der Kolk quickly realized that this approach was inadequate. He observed that talking about their experiences often made the veterans feel worse, not better. This realization led Van der Kolk on a journey of discovery. He began to explore how trauma affects the brain and body, and why traditional therapeutic approaches often fell short. He describes attending a conference where he first heard about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a diagnosis that was just beginning to be recognized. The chapter then shifts to discuss how trauma extends far beyond the battlefield. Van der Kolk explains how he began to see similar symptoms in patients who had experienced other types of trauma, such as childhood abuse, sexual assault, or domestic violence. He realized that trauma was a much more widespread issue than previously thought, affecting millions of people in various ways. Van der Kolk also touches on the historical context of trauma studies. He mentions early pioneers like Pierre Janet, who in the late 19th century recognized that traumatic experiences could lead to a fragmentation of consciousness. However, these early insights were largely forgotten or ignored for many decades. The author then brings us to more recent times, discussing how advances in neuroscience have allowed researchers to better understand the biological impact of trauma. He introduces the idea that trauma leaves lasting imprints on the brain and body, affecting how people think, feel, and relate to others. Throughout the chapter, Van der Kolk weaves in personal anecdotes and case studies that illustrate the complex nature of trauma. He describes patients who struggled with seemingly inexplicable physical symptoms, only to later uncover histories of trauma. These stories highlight the interconnectedness of mind and body in the experience of trauma. The chapter concludes by setting up the rest of the book. Van der Kolk promises to delve deeper into the neurobiology of trauma, explore various treatment approaches, and discuss the broader societal implications of recognizing and addressing trauma. Overall, Chapter 1 serves as a powerful introduction to the topic of trauma. It challenges readers to reconsider their understanding of trauma and its effects, setting the stage for a comprehensive exploration of this complex and crucial topic. Chapter 2: The Neurobiology of Trauma, explaining how traumatic experiences affect the brain and nervous system. Here's a narrative explanation of this chapter. Dr. Van der Kolk begins by introducing us to the case of Yud, a successful professional woman who, despite her outward accomplishments, struggles with intense panic attacks and a persistent feeling of danger. Through Uda's story, the author illustrates how trauma can profoundly impact a person's life, even years after the traumatic event. The chapter then takes us on a journey through the human brain, explaining its structure and function in relation to trauma. Van der Kolk describes the brain as a hierarchical system, with more primitive areas responsible for basic survival functions at the bottom, and more advanced areas responsible for complex thinking and decision-making at the top. He introduces us to key brain structures involved in the trauma response. The amygdala, often called the brain's smoke detector, is responsible for identifying potential threats and initiating the body's alarm response. The prefrontal cortex, on the other hand, is described as the watchtower, responsible for observing what's going on, predicting what will happen if you take a specific action, and helping to regulate emotions. Van der Kolk explains how trauma can disrupt the normal functioning of these brain areas. In traumatized individuals, the amygdala tends to be overactive, constantly on the lookout for danger. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex may be underactive, making it difficult for the person to rationally assess situations or calm themselves down. The author then introduces the concept of the autonomic nervous system, which controls our body's unconscious processes and plays a crucial role in the stress response. He describes how trauma can lead to dysregulation of this system, causing individuals to get stuck in states of either hyperarousal, fight or flight, or hypoarousal, freeze or shutdown. To illustrate these concepts, Van der Kolk shares the results of various brain imaging studies. He describes how researchers have observed differences in the brains of traumatized individuals, including changes in the size and activity of various brain regions. These findings help explain why trauma survivors often struggle with issues like emotional regulation, memory, and attention. The chapter also touches on the concept of memory in relation to trauma. Van der Kolk explains how traumatic memories are often stored differently than normal memories, leading to phenomena like flashbacks and intrusive thoughts. He describes how trauma can interfere with the brain's ability to integrate sensory experiences into a coherent narrative, leaving trauma survivors with fragmented, intense sensory impressions rather than a clear memory of events. Throughout the chapter, Van der Kolk weaves in more case studies and personal anecdotes, bringing the complex neurobiology to life through real-world examples. He describes patients who struggle with seemingly inexplicable physical symptoms, illustrating how trauma's effects on the brain can manifest in the body. The author concludes the chapter by emphasizing the plasticity of the brain, its ability to change and adapt. While trauma can have profound effects on the brain, Van der Kolk offers hope by explaining that with proper treatment, the brain can heal and rewire itself. Overall, Chapter 2 provides a comprehensive yet accessible explanation of the neurobiology of trauma. It lays the groundwork for understanding why trauma has such far-reaching effects and sets the stage for discussions of treatment approaches in later chapters. By explaining the biological basis of trauma responses, Van der Kolk helps readers understand that the symptoms of trauma are not just psychological, but have deep roots in the body's physiology. Chapter 3: The Psychological Experience of Trauma Survivors, exploring how trauma affects the mind and alters one's perception of the world. Here's a narrative explanation of this chapter. Dr. Van der Kolk begins by introducing us to the concept of dissociation, a common psychological response to trauma. He describes dissociation as a disconnection between thoughts, memories, feelings, actions, and sense of identity. Through various case studies, he illustrates how trauma survivors often struggle to fully inhabit their own bodies and minds, feeling detached from their surroundings and even from themselves. The author then takes us on a journey through the history of trauma psychology, starting with Pierre Janet's groundbreaking work in the late 19th century. Janet was one of the first to recognize that traumatic experiences could lead to a fragmentation of consciousness, causing individuals to lose their capacity to integrate their memories, emotions, and bodily sensations. Van der Kolk explains how this understanding of trauma was largely forgotten for much of the 20th century, as the field of psychology became dominated by behaviorism and psychoanalysis. He describes his own rediscovery of Janet's work and how it helped him better understand the experiences of his patients. The chapter then explores the concept of flashbacks, a hallmark symptom of trauma. Van der Kolk explains that flashbacks are not just vivid memories, but rather a reliving of the traumatic experience as if it were happening in the present moment. He describes how trauma can interfere with the brain's ability to process experiences into coherent narratives, leaving survivors with fragmented, intense sensory impressions that can be triggered unexpectedly. Through various patient stories, the author illustrates how trauma can profoundly alter one's sense of time, identity, and reality. He describes patients who feel as though they are constantly living in the past, unable to fully engage with the present moment. Others struggle with a fragmented sense of self, feeling like different people in different situations. Van der Kolk also delves into the concept of emotional regulation, explaining how trauma can disrupt an individual's ability to manage their emotions effectively. He describes how trauma survivors often oscillate between feeling overwhelmed by intense emotions and feeling numb or disconnected from their feelings altogether. The author introduces the idea of the window of tolerance, a range of arousal within which an individual can function effectively. He explains how trauma can narrow this window, leaving survivors easily triggered into states of either hyperarousal, anxiety, panic, anger, or hypoarousal, numbness, disconnection, depression. Throughout the chapter, Van der Kolk emphasizes the importance of the body in understanding and treating trauma. He explains how traumatic experiences are often stored in the body as physical sensations and how helping survivors reconnect with their bodies can be a crucial part of the healing process. The chapter concludes by touching on the concept of post-traumatic growth. While acknowledging the devastating effects of trauma, Van der Kolk also notes that some individuals are able to find meaning and personal growth in the aftermath of traumatic experiences. However, he stresses that this growth typically occurs only after the trauma has been properly processed and integrated. Overall, Chapter 3 provides a deep dive into the psychological landscape of trauma survivors. By exploring concepts like dissociation, flashbacks, and emotional dysregulation, van der Kolk helps readers understand the complex inner world of those who have experienced trauma. This understanding sets the stage for discussions of treatment approaches in later chapters, emphasizing the need for therapies that address both the mind and body in healing from trauma. Chapter for the long-lasting effects of trauma on the body and mind. Dr. van der Kolk uses this chapter to explore how traumatic experiences leave a permanent imprint on individuals, affecting their physiology, psychology, and behavior long after the traumatic event has passed. The chapter opens with a powerful anecdote about a Vietnam veteran named Tom. Despite being decades removed from his war experiences, Tom still struggles with intense physical and emotional reactions to certain triggers. Van der Kolk uses Tom's story to illustrate how trauma can continue to impact a person's life long after the immediate danger has passed. The author then introduces the concept of the flight or fight response, explaining how this natural survival mechanism can become dysregulated in trauma survivors. He describes how the body's stress response system, designed to protect us in times of danger, can become chronically activated in individuals who have experienced trauma. This leads to a state of constant hypervigilance, where the body and mind are always on high alert, even in safe situations. Van der Kolk goes on to explain the role of the autonomic nervous system in trauma responses. He describes how trauma can disrupt the balance between the sympathetic nervous system, responsible for activating the stress response, and the parasympathetic nervous system, responsible for calming the body. This imbalance can lead to a variety of physical and emotional symptoms, including anxiety, depression, and chronic pain. The chapter also explores the concept of body memory. Van der Kolk explains how traumatic experiences are often stored in the body as physical sensations, rather than coherent narratives. He describes how trauma survivors may experience intense physical reactions to triggers, even if they can't consciously remember the traumatic event. Through various case studies, the author illustrates how trauma can impact different bodily systems. He describes patients who struggle with chronic digestive issues, autoimmune disorders, and other physical ailments that seem to have their roots in past traumatic experiences. These stories highlight the profound connection between mind and body in the context of trauma. Van der Kolk also touches on the impact of trauma on brain development, particularly in cases of childhood trauma. He explains how early traumatic experiences can shape the developing brain, leading to long-lasting changes in brain structure and function. This can affect everything from emotion regulation to cognitive abilities. The author introduces the concept of alexithymia, a condition where individuals struggle to identify and describe their emotions. He explains how this is common among trauma survivors, who often become disconnected from their emotional experiences as a way of coping with overwhelming feelings. Throughout the chapter, van der Kolk emphasizes the importance of addressing both the psychological and physiological aspects of trauma. He argues that effective trauma treatment must go beyond talk therapy to include approaches that directly address the body's stress response system. The chapter concludes by touching on the concept of intergenerational trauma. Van der Kolk explains how the effects of trauma can be passed down from one generation to the next, not just through learned behaviors, but potentially through biological mechanisms as well. Overall, Chapter 4 provides a comprehensive look at the long-term impacts of trauma on the body and mind. By exploring concepts like chronic hyperarousal, body memory, and the physiological imprint of trauma, van der Kolk helps readers understand why trauma's effects can be so pervasive and long-lasting. This understanding sets the stage for discussions of holistic treatment approaches in later chapters, emphasizing the need for therapies that address both the psychological and physiological aspects of trauma. Chapter 5: The complex relationship between trauma, time, and memory. Dr. van der Kolk uses this chapter to explore how traumatic experiences can profoundly alter an individual's perception of time and their ability to form and recall memories. The chapter begins with a powerful anecdote about a patient named Marilyn, who struggles with severe dissociation and memory loss related to childhood trauma. Through Marilyn's story, van der Kolk introduces the concept of dissociative amnesia, where traumatic memories are locked away, inaccessible to conscious recall. Van der Kolk then takes us on a journey through the history of trauma research, focusing on the study of memory. He discusses the work of Pierre Janet, who in the late 19th century recognized that traumatic memories are stored differently than ordinary memories. Janet observed that traumatic memories often lack a narrative quality and instead consist of intense sensory impressions and emotional states. The author explains how this understanding of trauma and memory was largely forgotten during much of the 20th century, only to be rediscovered in recent decades. He describes the controversy surrounding repressed memories in the 1980s and 1990s, and how this led to a renewed interest in the nature of traumatic memory. Van der Kolk then introduces the concept of implicit and explicit memory. He explains that while explicit memory involves conscious recall of events, implicit memory involves unconscious, bodily responses to stimuli. In trauma survivors, implicit memories of the traumatic event can persist even when explicit memories are absent or fragmented. The chapter explores how trauma can disrupt the brain's ability to integrate experiences into a coherent timeline. Van der Kolk describes how trauma survivors often feel as if they are living in two different time zones, the present moment and the time of the trauma. This can lead to a sense of being stuck in the past, unable to fully engage with the present or plan for the future. Through various case studies, the author illustrates how trauma can affect different aspects of memory. He describes patients who struggle with autobiographical memory, unable to recall significant portions of their life story. Others experience intrusive memories or flashbacks, where traumatic experiences feel as if they are happening in the present moment. Van der Kolk also touches on the role of the hippocampus in memory formation and how trauma can impact this crucial brain structure. He explains how chronic stress and trauma can lead to hippocampal atrophy, potentially contributing to memory difficulties in trauma survivors. The chapter discusses the phenomenon of traumatic reenactment, where individuals unconsciously recreate aspects of their traumatic experiences. Van der Kolk explains how this can be seen as an attempt by the psyche to integrate and make sense of the traumatic experience. Throughout the chapter, the author emphasizes the importance of addressing memory issues in trauma treatment. He argues that helping survivors construct a coherent narrative of their experiences can be a crucial part of the healing process. Van der Kolk also introduces some therapeutic approaches that can help with traumatic memories, such as EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and neurofeedback. He explains how these techniques can help integrate fragmented traumatic memories and reduce their emotional intensity. The chapter concludes by touching on the concept of collective trauma and how societies remember, or forget, traumatic events. Van der Kolk argues for the importance of bearing witness to trauma, both on an individual and societal level. Overall, Chapter 5 provides a deep exploration of the complex relationship between trauma, time, and memory. By examining how trauma disrupts normal memory processes and alters one's perception of time, Van der Kolk helps readers understand the profound impact trauma can have on an individual's sense of self and their ability to engage with the world. This understanding sets the stage for discussions of treatment approaches in later chapters, emphasizing the need for therapies that can help integrate traumatic memories and restore a sense of continuity to the trauma survivor's life story. Chapter 6: The crucial role of interpersonal relationships in both the development of trauma and the healing process. Dr. Van der Kolk uses this chapter to delve into the concept of attunement, the ability to be in sync with others, and how trauma can disrupt this fundamental human capacity. The chapter opens with a touching story about Van der Kolk's grandson, illustrating the natural human tendency for connection and attunement from infancy. Through this anecdote, the author introduces the idea that our ability to connect with others is hardwired into our nervous systems from birth. Van der Kolk then takes us on a journey through the science of human connection. He explains the concept of mirror neurons, which allow us to understand and empathize with others by internally mimicking their actions and emotions. This neurological mechanism forms the basis for our ability to attune to others and is crucial for healthy social and emotional development. The author describes how early relationships, particularly between infants and their caregivers, shape the developing brain and nervous system. He introduces the concept of attachment theory, explaining how secure attachment in childhood lays the foundation for healthy relationships and emotional regulation throughout life. However, Van der Kolk also explores how trauma, especially early in life, can disrupt this natural attunement process. He describes how traumatic experiences, particularly those involving caregivers, can lead to difficulties in forming and maintaining relationships later in life. Trauma survivors often struggle with trust, intimacy, and emotional regulation in their interpersonal interactions. Through various case studies, the author illustrates how trauma can manifest in relationships. He describes patients who struggle with chronic feelings of emptiness, fear of abandonment, or difficulty reading social cues. These stories highlight how the effects of trauma ripple outward, impacting not just the individual but their entire social world. Van der Kolk also touches on the concept of intergenerational trauma, explaining how patterns of disconnection and dysregulation can be passed down from one generation to the next. He argues that breaking these cycles requires addressing not just individual trauma, but also focusing on repairing and strengthening relational bonds. The chapter then shifts to explore how attunement and connection can be powerful tools in the healing process. Van der Kolk describes various therapeutic approaches that leverage the power of human connection, such as group therapy, couples therapy, and family therapy. He explains how these modalities can help trauma survivors rebuild their capacity for trust and intimacy. The author also introduces some innovative treatment approaches that focus on fostering attunement and connection. He describes techniques like yoga, theater, and choir singing, which can help trauma survivors reconnect with their bodies and with others in a safe, structured environment. Throughout the chapter, Van der Kolk emphasizes the importance of the therapeutic relationship itself as a healing factor. He explains how a attuned, empathetic therapist can provide a corrective emotional experience for trauma survivors, helping them rebuild their capacity for healthy relationships. The chapter concludes by touching on the broader societal implications of trauma and disconnection. Van der Kolk argues for the importance of fostering connection and community as a way to prevent and heal from trauma on a larger scale. Overall, Chapter 6 provides a deep exploration of the relational aspects of trauma and healing. By examining how trauma disrupts our innate capacity for connection and how rebuilding that capacity is crucial for recovery, Van der Kolk highlights the fundamentally interpersonal nature of both trauma and healing. This understanding sets the stage for discussions of treatment approaches in later chapters, emphasizing the need for therapies that address not just individual symptoms, but also help rebuild the trauma survivor's ability to connect with others and the world around them. Thank you for listening. I hope this content is useful to you. If you like this kind of content, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to support our team.